Thank you. And we have another question coming in that we're going to take from Wisconsin. Does the EPA plan to exclusively use Subpart 2 for designations under the new standard, given the court's recent decision on the 1997 Phase 1 implementation? And Kimber, before you take that, could you just give a snapshot of what the court said and where we are with that?
Right. This will be in classifications, not designations. Designations are kind of separate, and that's just the boundary that's set around the area where it's said you have bad air. Classifications is what, based on the design value, the level of severity that we have there. So for the 97 standards, we had originally classified quite a few areas in the Subpart 1 classification system. That's what the court said no to us. So that's back to us. We're re-looking at that again. That proposal for the 97 standards in response to the court decision, we're hoping to be out in early fall, late summer. Whatever we do there, we may do the same thing for the 2008 NAAQS or not. We may take comment on a few things as it relates to Subpart 1 versus Subpart 2 for the new standard. The court didn't say you can never use Subpart 1 again, but they did not like the rationale that we used in Phase 1 originally. So, it may be that we end up doing the same thing for the 97 and 2008, or we may take comment on that issue. So I would stay tuned to our proposals this fall for both the 97 standard and the 2008 on the classifications.
And can you just describe a little bit what Subpart 1 is and what Subpart 2 is for those who might not be?
Subpart 1 areas mean you don't have the prescriptive requirements. You also don't have marginal, moderate, severe, extreme attached to your classification. You're just Subpart 1. You have to give us an attainment demonstration. You have to give us a SIP. But you don't have the different very prescriptive requirements that are required for Subpart 2.
Okay, great. And as I recall, that Subpart 2 was added in the 90 amendments, is that right?
That's correct.
And that's always been exclusively ozone, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, great. Okay, Susan, back to you. Is there anything parents of children should know about ozone and the dangers to their health? Do daycare centers pay attention to this? Should parents pay attention?
Well, in many areas, daycare centers do pay attention to this. In some states, there are guidelines for schools. We are working on guidelines for schools, but what parents need to know is that the exposures of their children in school are typically much shorter. If you think about it, recess could be 15 minutes. So for most kids, it's fine to go out for recess. And what we would advise parents to do, especially if their kids have asthma, is notice on a day when air pollution is bad, notice how their kids are responding, because typically the worst effects come either that evening or the next day. Oh. So if you have a code orange day and your child goes out to play, or maybe he goes out for practices, which are typically longer, see if they need their rescue medication that night or the next day. And then keep track of that. If there's another code orange day, see if that happens again. And if your child does need their rescue medication more often, if they have asthma, then that may be an indication that they need to reduce their exposure. So basically, the advice for a parent is pretty much the same as the advice for you as a jogger. Know what the air quality index is and develop a sense of what your susceptibility or sensitivities are.
Great. Okay. Well, and can you tell us a little bit, you described what an epidemiological study was.
Right.
Can you describe some of the clinical studies and what folks like at UNC are doing
Sure.
to find out more about ozone?
Yeah, a clinical study is a study where a healthy volunteer, and quite often they're college students, come into a center like our center at UNC Chapel Hill, and they're exposed in a chamber where we know exactly what they're being exposed to under different exertion levels. And in that type of setting, we know exactly what they're exposed to. We can monitor physiological parameters such as heart rate and lung function. And so we have a very clear idea of the effects caused by the pollutant involved. The weakness of clinical studies is typically they're healthy people. And so they underestimate the effects in sensitive populations. For example, most people with asthma wouldn't be part of a clinical study because you wouldn't want to expose them to something that might cause an asthma attack.
Great, that's very helpful, thanks. We have another question that was emailed in today. Many regions continue to move forward with voluntary air quality control strategies, but some stakeholders hesitate to implement voluntarily since they may not qualify for SIP credit. So Kimber, this sounds like one for you. Could you discuss how base years will be developed in the non-attainment designations process?
I can address the SIP credit piece first. We've done a number of guidances on how you can get SIP credit for voluntary programs. We've done a voluntary program guidance. We've done an emerging SIP measures guidance, which allows you to bundle measures and take SIP credit for it. We've also done some energy efficiency SIP credit guidance. So I think there's a number of ways out there that states can use, a number of guidance that they can work with their regional offices on to use to actually get SIP credit for their voluntary programs. Another thing that I didn't mention, it's related to early action compacts, but it's a different program. It's called our Ozone Flex policy. We did it for the 97 standards. We've had a few areas, I believe in the Region 6 area and in Texas, use them. That policy is actually for attainment areas, and it's working together with the stakeholders in that community, looking at voluntary programs so you can avoid becoming non-attainment. That's something that we're thinking about now for some of these areas that are out there that are very, very close to the standard. They're violating it now, but maybe with later years of data, they may not be violating. It'd be a really good idea to implement some of those voluntary programs this summer, next summer, to actually avoid having that 3 years of data when it gets close to designation time, and going ahead and implementing that. So that's another place where you can use voluntary programs is for maintenance, and now's the time to be doing some of that. For base years, I'm not sure. We have been working with some of our regional offices on allowing some reductions from voluntary programs to be included in projected baseline years, and that's another form of being allowed SIP credit when they're doing their modeling and they're projecting out for their attainment demonstration, going ahead and taking account for those reductions that they're getting from smart growth or other voluntary programs, and we've been working with Region 9 on some of this now. So, I mean, that's something we can look at. We can work with your regional office. We can work with the state to see how we can make that happen, because we want to encourage states to be working on voluntary programs, and we want to try to give them as much SIP credit as we can under the Act and through our policy and guidance.
Great. I think this one is for you, Susan.
Okay.
Some groups are saying that implementing the revised standard would be prohibitively costly.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of question about why doesn't EPA take that into account when setting the standards? Why is that?
Well, the Clean Air Act prohibits EPA from considering cost when setting a standard. And the Supreme Court recently upheld that we are not to consider costs when setting national ambient air quality standards. The cost considerations come into play when states decide on implementation strategies.
And so it's based purely on the science and the administrator's interpretation of the science? Is that fair to say?
Well, it's a public health policy decision, definitely.
Okay, great. Kimber, can you talk at all about what we're you've talked a little bit just then in the Ozone Flex policy about, and the base year question, about what years of data we're going to be using. Do you think maybe that was what the questioner was getting at? Can you remind us again what you've said about what the 2008 designation, 2008 ozone standard designation will be?
Right. I think the recommendations that are coming in for ozone will be used either 05 to 07 or 06 to 08 for the state recommendations. When we go final in 2010, we'll either be looking at 06 to 08 at the earliest. It's possible we could look at 2007 to 2009. Again, it depends on if you have a really, really long ozone season, and you have your recommendations due in March, and you have to QA that data before then. It's possible we'll need to rely on the 06 to 08 data. We'll just have to see how things go the closer we get to that time frame on finalizing our designations.
And in the past, we have states have informed us after the governors have recommended. Has there been any leeway there?
Yes. When we did designations in 2004, December 2004, for the PM 2.5 annual standard, those were due in December. We allowed some time between January and April for states to come back in with a later set of data to change those recommendations. So there is a precedent for that. We obviously want to use the best quality assured latest data that's available before we finalize designations. So,
okay.
Yeah. Thanks.
We have another question here. I think maybe one or both of you could answer, which is about the role of international transport. Have either of you had any experience with? Are there circumstances where international transport plays a role in someone's air quality?
Sure. Under the Act, we have Section 179B, which is a specific section for border areas that if you have transport emanating from across the border, this has happened, in Texas specifically, and maybe along the border with U.S. Canada up in the Northeast, where it's specifically coming from a border area, and there is a provision in the Clean Air Act to deal with that. Recently, there's been quite a few studies and a lot of work happening on, how much background is coming in into California all the way into the middle of the U.S. We've actually seen for coming in from ozone coming from Asia. I think some of that is taken into account in some of the scientific work for the standard, just in terms of background levels. Now, what does that mean for implementation? It's something states should be aware, especially the western states. When transport could be coming from Asia, it's going to come into California. We've seen some studies that have it coming all the way into the middle of the United States. States need to be aware of that as they're doing their attainment demonstrations and knowing what kind of background levels could be coming in. That situation could be getting as we move forward to 2020, as we clean up our air, and our map looks pretty good with fewer non-attainment areas, the growth in Asia is going to grow. And it could become more of an issue for some of those major urban areas along our west coast and other areas that just already have big challenges in attaining the standards. It could become an issue, and it's something that we're looking at. It's something that our scientists are involved in. It's something that we're working with the international community on from a technical perspective right now, and we'll continue to do that.
Is the U.S. involved with any negotiations on ozone in the past or now?
Yes, we work with the Economic Commission for Europe on. We've done negotiations in the past on ozone, on acid rain. We've also worked with Canada on bilateral agreements for ozone. We have an ozone annex under the U.S.-Canada bilateral air quality agreement that was signed in 2000. We do some voluntary memorandum of understanding type work with Mexico. We have bilateral programs with China, in particular, trying to do some capacity building in those countries to help reduce their air pollution. We're looking right now at negotiations with Canada on PM, and we are in the middle of negotiations on a PM annex to our air quality agreement with Canada. We're also working with the Europeans on possibly starting negotiations on PM. That hasn't happened yet. We've only focused on ozone and acid rain with those types of international treaties, but we are moving forward and looking at possibly doing something on PM. Hemispheric transport is part of that technical work that leads up to those negotiations. So it's something that we're looking at from a scientific perspective right now, and it may be something that we'll just have to see how those discussions go on how that ends up in terms of any kind of commitments.
Okay, thank you. Well, if you have questions about international transboundary pollution, the ozone standard, or the health effects of ozone, please get your questions in. We're coming to the end of our broadcast. We have about 5 minutes left. If you could call, the number is 1-888-228-6736, and the fax number is 919-715-3569, and our email address is open@ncmail.com. staff.net. Okay, and I'm back in the studio audience here in North Carolina with Kimber Scavo, Group Leader for the State and Local Programs Group at the Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards, and with Susan Stone, Senior Environmental Policy Analyst, also with the EPA Office of Air Quality Planning and Standards. Okay, I'm still looking for your questions, so please join us. And again, the phone number is 1-888-228-6738. Kimber, one of the questions that we've been getting that is a difficult one, which is what happens if an area fails to attain the standard? Are there some sort of penalties, or is there anything?
That's a good question. For ozone, we have a voluntary reclassification process. So if a state knows that their area is not going to attain by their attainment date, they can voluntarily request a reclassification to a higher level. We sometimes refer to this as a bump up. We've had some come in for the 97 standards recently. Some of our moderate areas could not attain, didn't think they can attain the 2010 standards, so they submitted a voluntary request for a higher classification. At that time, we go through a process working with the state. We do a rulemaking. We set a new SIP due date. They have more time to attain, but again, they also get that suite of additional prescriptive measures that they have to do along with that. If an area fails to submit a SIP, that's when we start the clock, the 18-month clock. We do a findings of failure to submit, and that's what could actually result in penalties such as sanctions and then FIPS if it becomes 2 years. So for failure to attain, you don't actually get those sanctions and FIPS right then.
And that's an important point.
Right.
That's
right. We would, if you fail to attain by your attainment date and you're a lower classification, we would automatically reclassify you to a higher classification, give you a longer attainment date, give you all those additional measures that you have to do for ozone for those higher classifications. So that's the process if you fail to attain. The penalties come in, as we said, if you don't get your SIP on time, or we don't approve. If you submit a SIP that's not approvable and we have to do a disapproval, those clocks start at that point as well.
Okay, that's very helpful to lay that out, because I think there is a perception that if you don't meet your attainment date, then highway sanctions or other things might kick in, but that's not really the case.
Right.
It's a question of if you're participating and planning well. That's really what's
right.
What the Clean Air Act intended. We have a couple of questions in here. This one is from Texas. In response to earlier questions, Ms. Scavo noted that EPA staff is currently working on potentially 4 rules to address issues arising out of the South Coast decision of
That's
the D.C.
correct.
Circuit, including issues relating to NSR anti-backsliding. Would you please elaborate on what issues a NSR anti-backsliding rule would address? In particular, would such a rulemaking address issues relating to how and when states should apply major source thresholds under the 1-hour ozone NAAQS?
I think that our proposal will be addressing that issue. And again, that I did mention a possibility of 4 rulemakings. NSR is one of those. NSR may go in with our classification and contingency measure rulemaking. It just depends, or we may split it off and have its own NSR anti-backsliding rulemaking. But that is one of the issues that we will be addressing in that proposal. Raj Rao is the group leader now for the New Source Review Group. He's working on that proposal. The staff person working on that is David Painter. And the two of them together, I'm not sure if they have a similar process with the states or conference calls and that type of thing where they go through that, but we have been trying to continually brief the NACA criteria pollutants call on what's going on with those rulemakings, as well as working with our regions on the text of those rulemakings.
Okay. And what's interesting to me about this question is it's talking about the 1-hour ozone NAAQS. Can you just quickly, for those who may not be fully schooled in the history of ozone, what's the difference between the 1-hour and the 8-hour standard?
Well, the 1-hour standard was set long ago as 0.12 ppm. It's based on 1 hour instead of 8-hour averaging time. That rule we actually revoked when the 1997 8-hour standard came along. But when we did that, we had a suite of anti-backsliding requirements that states had to meet to address the revoked 1 hour standard. And that's what the court said we didn't do right. And that's what we're going to have to go back and address. So that proposal for the 97 standard is addressing 1 hour new source review. Now when we do our transition rule for the 2008 standard, again, we'll have to look at new source review issues for transition to the 2008 standard too. So the question, is it 1 hour, is it 8 hour? We'll really be looking at both in two separate rulemakings.
Great. Okay, we're coming to the end of our broadcast, so if you'd like to get your questions in, please call 1-888-228-6736, or you can fax us at 919-715-3569, or get those emails in open@ncmail.net.